administrator and political activist and columnist. He was former public administrator. Some of his achievements as administrator include rehabilitation of 8,000 families in Vizag who are displaced by the steel plant, and large-scale irrigation projects like a 2 lakh acre dry land irrigation in Prakasam district. Later, he resigned from IAS and has since then has been leading the Lok Satta movement against corruption and world politics. Under his able leadership, Lok Satta played a prominent role in achieving electoral reforms and Right to Information Act and several other reforms. Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan is presently a member of Andhra Pradesh Legislative Assembly, and his party has branches in 5 states and contested in 3 states. And he also coordinates with several overseas organizations like Federal Democratic Reforms India and People for Lok Satta. As part of People for Lok Satta Rejuvenate campaign, he is presently touring several cities in United States and advocating some of the solutions to the challenges India facing, like proportional representation, local government, NRA voting rights, and NRA role in Indian politics. Thanks, JP Garu, for making time in his busy schedule, and thank event organization team for making this happen. Without no further delay, I invite Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. Sorry for initial trouble.
Friends, I'm delighted to be here with you. Oftentimes, when somebody is very tall, there's a natural advantage in life. For once, I found that Prasanna being very tall actually was a disadvantage. The microphone was a little at a lower level, and I was amused by this idea that what appears to be of great advantage sometimes could actually be a problem on occasion. I think that's important when we discover things about a society, about a nation, about an economy, and in many ways, about many organizations. I was asked to make a few points about Indian economy and politics, and I've chosen the theme 19th century politics and 21st century economy. Can they coexist? And if there are some serious issues here, what can we do to make things better? If the 20th century offered us any lessons, it is that you cannot delink economics from politics. The biggest question decided in the 20th century, we all know, was whether or not the socialist economy was right or the market economy was right. It's a central political question. Ultimately, we recognize that the economic growth of a country is not neutral to the political trajectory of that nation. And in 1991, when the Berlin Wall collapsed, in 1989 when the Berlin Wall collapsed, in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, and much of the world embraced market economy, but with certain changes, certain significant changes, then the assumption now in the world is that humankind has discovered what works best in terms of economic growth and political organization. But I think we all should recognize that it's not an unadulterated victory of market economy. The market economy won because they have actually absorbed some of the socialist principles. In the first half of the 20th century, education and healthcare were not regarded as government's business. But in the second half of the 20th century, almost every major country in the world of any consequence embraced both education and healthcare as part of government's business. The services may be provided by the private sector, but it must be driven by the public sector. That's the broad understanding. In a very, very fundamental sense, it is this synthesis of some of the socialist principles with the market economy that made the success of market economy possible. Therefore, I would like to start off my presentation with a brief discussion on the role of state. what is it that the modern state should be doing? Instead of debating whether it should be socialist or market-based, what is the role of the state? In India, this question has now been adequately addressed. I would like to argue that the state is primarily meant for public order, justice, and rule of law, apart from the defense of the realm and so on and so forth. And then it must be essentially to enhance the capabilities of the citizens of the society so that the accident of birth, accident of the womb, as Warren Buffett called it, does not determine the fate of a child. And that is education and health care. And then, of course, infrastructure required for a modern economy. In particular, transport and power sector, because communications, thanks to all of you guys, the government's role is now very marginal except minimal regulation, really. And then natural resources development, there's no way anybody but a state actor is going to do something like Tennessee Valley Authority or a Hoover Dam. It has to be a government's business. And finally, social security, a measure of social security so that those who fall into the cracks, their concerns can be addressed in a humane, modern society. Once we look at state and its role with greater clarity in this manner, I think a lot of questions can be addressed much better. The economic story of India in the past 10, 15, 20 years is by now reasonably well understood across the world. In 1947, we started with 2% of the global GDP. If there is something called global GDP. But not too long ago, in human history terms, about 3 centuries or 4 centuries before that, India's share of the world economy was something like 25%. But over a period of 150 to 200 years, because we did not really take advantage of the Industrial Revolution, India fell to 2% of the global GDP. By 1991, this fell down to 1% of the GDP. The economy in India grew at a snail's pace. But in terms of the global economy, our share came down to 1%. In 1991, as we all know now, the current Prime Minister, as Finance Minister of India, in the wake of an enormous crisis, out of compulsion, not conviction, engineered a near U-turn in our economic policies. Today, we are back at 2% of the global GDP. In other words, we ran very hard for 63 years to remain where we were, in relative terms. Not that India hasn't progressed at all, but we still are where we were in 1947. But the general perception is, with reasonably good growth rates, though still not matching China's, and with some evidence of sustaining those growth rates, India could well be one of the major economies of the world in the next few decades. The Emerging Markets Forum says by 2039, if India does a few things right, we could well be the second largest economy in the world. That China will be the largest is more or less accepted now. I think there are very few people in the world who think that anything else is possible now. But the future, of course, may tell us a different story. Whether India will actually fulfill her potential is a great challenge. My argument is, India has the potential to achieve this miracle, but we have to make this miracle happen. Our politics has become now a great impediment to economic growth and to fulfilling India's potential. If you look at politics of India in the past 60 years, there's a huge success story. At one level, India is the first country in the world to embrace universal adult franchise on the first day that the Constitution was written. For a largely illiterate and extremely poor country to embrace adult franchise on a universal basis from day one was actually a great adventure. It was an enormous expression of faith in the wisdom of the bulk of the people of the country. This very great country in which we are right now, the first republic in the modern world, the first democracy in the modern world, the first country to practice separation of powers, the first country with a written constitution, despite recognition that all human beings are equal, it took them something like 144 years after those immortal words were written in the Declaration of Independence to recognize that women are equal to men. It took a civil war and the sacrifice and the blood and gore of more than 10% of the able-bodied youth of this country to recognize that people of another skin color are the same as any other skin color. Given that context, and given the fact that Britain took centuries before women got the right to vote in 1928, it was actually a remarkable expression of faith on the part of Indian constitution makers to recognize that all Indians, irrespective of caste, religion, language, and we have many, many, many languages. Even here, I'm sure many people do not realize how many languages there are in India. Serious languages with thousands of years history, hundreds of years history, their own literature, their own script, and their own unique culture. Despite all this, and despite the fact that India was actually partitioned on the basis of religion, the Indian constitution makers put enormous faith in the people of the country. And in some respects, I think that faith is fully vindicated. If you take India's political evolution, it's a remarkable success story in the sense that A, we retained our political freedoms. B, there is intense electoral competition. Elections in India are not make-believe elections. C, the winners do not punish the losers. There are many countries in the world where the loser is punished merely because he lost the election. He may lose his head or liberty or many things. In India, that never happened, mercifully. And finally, the elected government is truly in authority. It's not some coterie or Janatha. Going by these four postulates, India is a truly vibrant, functioning democracy. And that we could actually maintain a moderate rate of growth in the economy and now emerge as a reasonably influential country in terms of the future economy of the globe, it's a source of some satisfaction. But the fact is, there are also many dark corners of Indian politics. And unless they are set right, unless we throw light over them, unless we change that, we may not fulfill our true economic potential. Particularly because India is largely poor and because most people are still illiterate, because politics is seen as a power struggle without any reference to ideologies or any outcomes, because there's increasing contention in politics, but there's only change of players and there's no change in the outcomes. There's no change in the rules of the game. Money has become the currency of politics. For those of you from the United States, it may appear that it's a very normal thing in politics. After all, in the US, they spend a lot of money in politics. But these are two different worlds altogether. The money spent here is entirely for legitimate campaigning purposes, most of it for television advertising. It's fully accounted. And it's transparent. Sadly, much of the money spent in elections in India is unaccounted and for illegitimate purposes, mostly for vote buying with money and liquor. So the market economy actually works in politics of India. And that's what ought to be changed. The second perversion of Indian politics is, in a country of abject poverty, it's very easy for the governments to seduce the voters, offering them all kinds of freebies, unsustainable in the long term, very detrimental to public good. But in the short term, there's always a way of persuading the voter that a free power, free color television, free rice, and every month some amount of money, irrespective of everything else, that will be given once the government assumes office. I'm not mentioning these things as casual. These are all real sops offered in India by political parties. Some of them actually were delivered. There's a state of Tamil Nadu where every family was offered a color television, and they were actually delivered in a significant measure. I don't know how many were delivered finally, but millions of color televisions were delivered by the elected government as part of the promise that they made to the electorate before election. So increasingly, parties are resorting to this kind of thing, taking advantage of the poverty. The third is, of course, in a very diverse country with many primordial loyalties, it's very easy to divide people on caste, region, religion, and language, and mobilize them as voting blocks without a sense of what's in it for me if I vote for this party or that party, because there's no sense that any party would make any difference, and therefore there's only emotional purchase available. Once we have these three attitudes in politics, which are increasingly dominant in the mainstream political parties, we have a serious crisis. We have elections, We have peaceful transfer of power, we have fierce contention, we have liberty, but the electoral outcomes are simply not what India needs. And that's what ought to be changed. And therefore, my argument is that this kind of a 19th century political mode, a medieval political mode, where politics is really about power struggle, where we mastered the art of getting into power without bothering about the outcomes, that cannot be coexisting with the 21st century economy. One of them has to give way. Either politics must change or economy will eventually decline and collapse. What will happen depends on what we do in the next 10 years or so in India. A comparison with China would be very apt because many people obviously are interested in the two Asian giants. In terms of population, we are number one, number two respectively. In terms of growth rates among large economies, now China is number one and India is pretty close to being number two. And in terms of potential, India could well emerge as one of the economic giants of the world in the next 30 years if we do well. So obviously comparisons are inevitable. But I think one has to understand things in perspective. One argument often advanced is that China is not a democracy, therefore they can do pretty much what they want, and therefore they can actually focus on accelerated economic growth, even at the cost of short-term political price. Because after all, one of the great challenges of democratic politics anywhere in the world is the conflict between the short-term political price you have to pay for pursuing right policies and the long-term slow rate of social payoff. It's one of the most difficult things anywhere in the world. That's why we all love to hate politicians, because politicians have to wrestle with this all the time. They have to reconcile conflicting interests and satisfy all groups, and they have to be mindful of the short-term political price and yet focus on the long-term public good. These are awesome challenges. Obviously, in a dictatorship, you don't have these problems. It's easier. Nevertheless, I think we are overstating the case when we try and say that democracy is detrimental to economic growth. I would like to argue that almost everything good that happened in China is actually because of democratization of society. And almost everything bad that happened in China after their 1948 revolution was because Chinese leadership on occasion acted autocratically and in an arbitrary manner. Take the later case, the Great Leap Forward. Between 1959 and 62, because of Mao Zedong's utterly irrational policies, arbitrary policies, 20 million Chinese starved to death. 1959 to 62. It was not because of any sensible policies. The autocracy of China actually caused perhaps the greatest man-made misery in the 20th century. Similarly, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. It was again another leadership blunder. But the good things that happened in China were because they tried to democratize education, healthcare access, decentralization of power, technology to villages, enhancing productivity. These are all tools of democratization. An authoritarian leadership actually enhanced the content of democracy. We always think in terms of democracy as merely voting. Democracy is more than that. We have in India great liberty. But are we a democratic society fully in some respects? I suspect not. In some respects, I dare to argue that China is perhaps more democratic than India. You take the local governments in China. They are far more influential. There's far greater decentralization of power. There's greater citizen empowerment at that local level than in India today. Everything in India revolves on the Prime Minister, the Chief Minister at the provincial level, and the district magistrate at the district level. The citizens and the communities and local governments have hardly any role at all. Similarly, education, healthcare, the essence of a modern democracy, have never been given the kind of importance that they deserved in India. What I'm arguing is the normative democracy in terms of constitution and elections are necessary but not sufficient. We have to actually have a functioning democracy in terms of society being democratized, in terms of people's future being decided not by the accident of birth, accident of the womb, but by their hard work, and the society must give an opportunity for everybody to fulfill her true potential. In that sense, we have a lot to learn from China. This categorization, crude categorization of something is a democracy, something is not, based merely on certain indicators, is not sufficient. And India must learn with humility the art of democratization of our society. if that is the case, what are the things India should do? I'll come to the concluding part of my presentation so that we can have some time for meaningful interaction. Because I'm making a controversial point, I'm aware of that. And I think it requires some serious examination. First is local governments. One great thing that happened in India is a maturation of federalism. India is a multilingual country. In your northern neighborhood in Canada, after all, there's only one other language apart from English spoken by the Quebec people, the French language. And yet every 5 years or so, there is a demand for secession, and there's some kind of accommodation for the time being, and we never know when Canada is going to break up. You see a tiny country like Belgium, for instance. Again, 2 languages, and every other day there is a fight breaking out. Right now I'm told that there is no government in office there. They're figuring out who should be the prime minister. You see Sri Lanka, our own southern neighbor. There's only one other language, Shimhala language, the main language of the country. And the minority northern Tamils, they spoke the Tamil language. And because the country did not know how to reconcile the linguistic aspirations of these 2 groups, there was a bloody civil war, tens of thousands of people died. One of the most murderous terrorist groups was on rampage for decades, and only recently they have been able to overcome the terrorist group, and hopefully they have learned the lesson. And now the indications are that they are trying to follow the Indian model of federalism. In India, in contrast, there are at least 18 major languages. It's not like China where Mandarin is spoken and understood by 85% of the people, and all the other ethnic nationalities, apart from Han Chinese, they are only 15% of the people. In India, the largest language is spoken only by about 40% people, 40 to 45% people, Hindi. In that again, there are so many dialects that Bhojpuri is different from the chaste Hindi of, let's say, Bhopal or Indore. And the other language, second biggest language, Telugu, is spoken by about 8.5% of the people. All other languages are now of that order, 8%, 6%, 5%, etc. And yet, despite having 18 languages, each of them with their own literature, their own culture, their own tradition, and their own history for centuries, some for millennia, India could actually unite all of them, and our federalism today matured. When the Constitution was written, while we were a federal country, it was actually quasi-federal. The federal government was more in command because the founding fathers were terrified of the possibility of further balkanization of India, given the experience of partition of India in 1947. But over the past 25 years, one of the great things that happened in India is this federalism has now become very mature. The states have come into their own. They have now considerable leeway in deciding things and in presiding their own destinies. But the tragedy is the states in turn have not recognized the need to encourage local communities to be self-governing. Despite a constitutional injunction, and we have huge amendments in 1994 running into 7,700 words. If you compare that with the American Constitution, the whole of American Constitution today, some 222 years after it was written, it has some 7,400 words. Our provisions relating to local governments alone, they run into 7,700 words. And yet we created overstructured, underpowered local governments, and the bureaucracy, of which I was a member for a long time, the state legislatures, of which I am a member currently, these two have conspired to ensure that the local governments are enfeebled. There is absolutely no desire in India to really empower the communities and to see that the people can preside over their own destinies. Unless India recognizes the merit of decentralization in a very complex and vast country, we will never be able to deliver services. Without local government empowerment, you cannot have a linkage between authority and accountability. You cannot have a clear understanding in the minds of the people between their vote and public good that results from that. And most of all, you cannot have a link between taxes and services rendered. And therefore, there will be always a reluctance to pay taxes. In India, tax avoidance is a national sport. I'm sure many of us dislike to pay taxes. But in India, we really elevated that to a very high quality sport. Our tax GDP ratio, even today, is only about 18%. That means only 18% of the GDP is collected by any government at any level, federal, local, or state, towards taxes. Compare that with the United States. It's about 40% in this country. Go to Europe. Most countries are 50%. Some countries are 60%. Now, we may not have to go to 60% and 50%, but to actually have a decent functioning state to fulfill its responsibilities, the tax rates must go higher. There must be greater tax compliance. That will never happen as long as the bulk of the people of India do not see the link between the taxes they pay and the services they get. And therefore, there will be always a move towards getting something on the quick. There will be always a desire for short-term maximization. Let me get some freebie, this rice or this free power or this free color TV, because I know this is something tangible that I get, and I don't know what else I'll get anyway. Therefore, that's all I expect from politics, and let the country be damned. If that is to be changed, people must see where the tax money is going, and they must understand the alternative uses for the tax money. For all these reasons, we have to empower the local governments, the way, for instance, China, despite being an autocratic regime, has actually been trying to do. The second major change required is rule of law. Normatively, India has an impeccable system of rule of law. The judiciary is independent. The Supreme Court is pretty strong, perhaps not as strong as the United States, but next to US, probably our judiciary is the strongest in the world. We have many independent constitutional organs, like the Election Commission, the world's most powerful election commission, the electoral oversight body, and many other organs. But nevertheless, the rule of law is pretty weak. The norms are different from the practice. The police are entirely under the control of the political executive in almost every state of the country. We cannot even conceive of a situation like that happened in Illinois state in your country when Rod Blagojevich, when he tried to sell the senator's appointment for a prize. He was promptly thrown out of office. He is probably politically buried forever, and he may even go to jail. If you applied that standard in India, I'm afraid about 95% of us would be found wanting. And unless we actually create a system where there's a fierce independence of the crime investigation authority, anti-corruption agencies, and independent prosecution, and speedy justice. Our justice system is independent, but it's very, very slow and ponderous. I don't want to go into details as to what needs to be done. There are simple, elegant answers to that. I myself, as a member of the Administrative Reforms Commission, have specifically come out with a series of proposals to bring about significant changes within the bounds of our Constitution. So the answers are evident, but we have to actually apply them so that the culture of VIPs, very important persons, the culture of cronyism, the culture of patronage, the culture of those in power determining all outcomes, even in justice system, and even in terms of crime investigation. Unless we change these things, we are in serious trouble. After all, the strength of a market economy is that the market operates equally for everybody. It's a level playing field. And if the contracts are not honored, if those in power decide what will happen, who the next billionaire is going to be, and those who actually do business in India are worried about how to enforce the contracts, then obviously there will be a serious setback to businesses. The third big change we require is to fight corruption. Corruption is obviously prevalent in many countries. Blagojevich case shows in America is no exception. But in countries like India, it's ubiquitous. It is universally believed that if you want to do business in India, you have to be corrupt. Countries like the US have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is now later adopted by the European Commission, and eventually now has become United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Nevertheless, the fact is in many countries, if you want to actually do serious business, unless you please those in government or in politics, you cannot move forward. And unless that is changed, I'm afraid Indian economic growth will be stalled. If you want to contain corruption, again, the answers are self-evident. What you have done to Rod Blagojevich in this country must be possible for everybody in India. Speedy justice, confiscation of properties, throwing them in jail, getting them out of politics, those who are corrupt, and creating a mechanism for political campaign finance. We have an excellent law on campaign finance in India enacted in 2003. Lok Satta movement, and I was privileged to be a part of that, is largely responsible for bringing about that law. It's an excellent law. In the United States, for instance, in the wake of Watergate in 1970s, you brought in the campaign finance reform law after Nixon's resignation. But since then, for about 40 years, there's been no serious change. And then came, for about 35 years, and then came the Feingold-McCain law, which is actually a feeble legislation to improve the campaign finance system. India has arguably one of the finest campaign finance laws, except that it's simply not implemented. The parties don't care about it. Ours perhaps is the only party in India which goes by that in letter and spirit. Unless we make it mandatory to actually implement that, and unless vote buying ceases, we are in serious trouble. But meanwhile, we have to address the challenges of corruption by institutional mechanisms, by creating an independent, strong anti-corruption agency, an independent prosecution, by punishing swiftly and surely the corrupt people, by setting a strong example, punitive example, and by doing several other things that many other countries have successfully done to curb corruption substantially. Finally, politics is all about incentives, just like economics. If in a poor country like India, vote buying is what gets you to the winning post, I suspect many people will continue to buy the votes, many people will continue to sell the votes. If the buyer and seller are happy, no law, no constitution can really set that right. We have to change the incentives. The Indian electoral system is a legacy of the colonial Britain. It's not at all a rational system. It's utterly irrational. I believe Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time, actually argued in favor of other models like the American presidential system and the European proportional representation system. But the Indians said, no, we are more British than all of you guys. We'll have to persevere with your own electoral system, even if we get rid of you. And it's actually happening today. In Britain, except in the House of Commons, in every other election, they have given up this old-fashioned first-past-the-post system. In the regional parliaments of Scotland, Northern Wales, and Ireland, the system is proportionality-based. In local elections, it's proportionality-based. European Parliament, proportionality-based. London City, an elected executive, an elected mayor. Right now, Boris Johnson, as you know, is the mayor. Earlier, the first mayor in this new mode of election is Ken Livingstone. India is the only country that's sticking with the old-fashioned British Westminster first-past-the-post model. It appears that Britain may actually be changing that to the House of Commons level also. We all know what happened in the last week when the two parties, for the first time after the Second World War in Britain, headed by Cameron and Nick Clegg, they now joined forces to form a coalition government. And eventually, in the next 2-3 years, we may well see in Britain a shift to some form of proportionate representation. The reason why India requires a shift is, if one vote extra means victory, one vote less means defeat, in an abjectly poor country where the political culture is already considerably damaged, vote buying is rampant. Vote buying will continue, corruption will continue, politics will be distorted. We have to change it to a system where a few votes this way, that way don't matter. It's the percentage of votes you get. It's not how much you control a constituency. As a local zamindar, as we call, a local chief, a man with complete clout, complete domination of the local population. That's what really gives political dividends in India today. We have to change it to a system where it's the image of the party and the candidates and the platform of the political party, rather than the inducements offered to individuals to get the marginal vote, that will determine the political outcomes. If we do these things, then we could have probably changed India's political system from the 19th century archaic model to something approximating the 21st century. And our economy and our politics can coexist. Einstein once said, 20th century is characterized by perfection of means and confusion of ends. Indian politicians have mastered the art of acquiring power. They perfected the means. But what power is about in terms of outcomes is something that eludes us all the time. There's hardly any change in respect of what happens, no matter who is in office. And that's what should be changed in India. I believe Indian people are alive to these challenges. They're capable of addressing them, but they require a nudge and push from all over the world, wherever compatriots of Indian compatriots are there. People of Indian origin are there. The businesses in India or Indian businesses, they must argue for change, because they must not think politics is different from economics. There is a notion in business circles that what we do business is unrelated to what kind of politics takes shape. Politics has a decisive influence on the way businesses take shape, on the way economic growth trajectory takes shape. And unless we address the larger questions of politics without being partisan, without really getting into who should be in power, but focusing on what should be the outcomes, unless we do that, economy itself will be in peril. Indian businesses are now slowly awakening themselves to this reality. We require to change fundamentally. I believe we will change. When status quo is unsustainable, change is inevitable. That's why the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. It did not fall because of any bullets or warfare. It fell because the people voted with their feet, because they could see the contrast between what's happening across the borders, across the wall, and in their own society. And they could not take it any longer. And no society could repress its people forever. And a democratic society certainly will change when people want it adequately, but people must be awakened to the possibilities of change. But the danger is, change may still happen, it may not be the right kind of change. 20 years ago, there was a very popular story in Moscow. I believe hundreds of people were queuing in front of a ration shop for a few crumbs of bread in Moscow city on a bitter, biting, cold winter morning. They waited and waited, but there was no bread in sight. One young man lost his temper after some time. He said, "I'm sick and tired of it. I'll go and kill the general secretary in Kremlin." And he stormed off in protest. The others still waited patiently because there was still the midnight knock, there was still the secret police, the Gestapo or whatever they call it in Soviet Union. There were still the concentration camps, the gulags. Therefore, they all waited very quietly and patiently. This young man came back after 2 hours. The others still were waiting, and there was no bread in sight. They all gathered on him and asked him, "What happened? Have you killed the general secretary? Is there a riot in Kremlin? Can we rob this store now? Our children are hungry at home. Please tell us what happened. What happened?" This young man said, "I went there to kill the general secretary, but there was a much longer queue waiting there." This story was recounted in every single household of Soviet Union, in all the 15 republics at that time. People laughed about it, but they did nothing about it. Change did come in 1991, but not the kind of change any Soviet citizen wanted. Change will always come. It will always overtake us eventually, every society. The challenge is it the kind of change that we all need, we all desire, and that will be positive? Or is it a change we'll have to submit ourselves to and pay the price for? That's the challenge facing Indian people, Indian politicians, Indian civil servants, and Indian businessmen. I believe we are capable of rising to the challenge and fulfilling our potential and becoming one of the great economies and one of the most moderating influences in the modern world, in a complex, ever-changing, unpredictable world. But only if we set our house in order today. And I believe the stakes for the world are as great as they are for India, because what happens to 1/6 of humanity cannot but impact the rest of the world. And I believe the rest of the world is actually waiting for this caged lion to really find its own feet and find its own direction. And I believe ultimately 21st century economy and 21st century politics will coincide and show the way to many other countries in the emerging economies which continue to believe that economic growth and political freedom cannot coexist. We have to prove that these two can and must coexist. The challenge in that sense is fundamental and it's human. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions, comments, criticism. Do we have a caller microphone? No? Okay, it's all right.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I think you said it perfectly when you said, we've perfected the means, but not the ends. One of the things I find common in Indian politics is there is rationality. There is no rationality in the structure. There is a structural deficit when it comes to reason. For example, take that Tamil Nadu TV promise. There was no motivation to actually say, okay, we are promising a TV for every household, but this is what it's going to buy us. Or, for example, even if you take the Supreme Court, right? Right now, the new Chief Justice came up, and I mean, like, he took office. First day, 29 minutes, he cleared 35 cases by simply dismissing most of them. And the thing is, I mean, all these things are quite arbitrary. And the reason why that is before somebody, like any official, any organization, any body does something, there is no requirement or motivation to say why they are doing it, what is the purpose, what is the measurable goal they are trying to achieve, any of that. I wonder if you could speculate on what could be done to promote that kind of.
It's a good question. I'll address each of these briefly so that we get a sense of what it's about. Take the Supreme Court. Normatively, the Supreme Court is supposed to function like the American Supreme Court. But we bungled even in the initial stages, to be fair. Instead of making it a constitutional court, which it ought to be in a very large federal country, we made it also an appellate court on practically everything under the sun. And also we gave it original jurisdiction on certain issues. The net result is, in the United States, in your Supreme Court, typically about 100 or 150 cases, I may be wrong by an order of magnitude of 10-20%. Only that many cases are taken every year. And they are heard continuously by all the 9 justices. And at the end of the year, if there are some 25 cases never heard, they are all set aside because they'll come another day. A constitutional court doesn't have to see everything under the sun. Whereas in India, typically every year we have tens of thousands of cases going before the courts, and therefore the courts have to be very arbitrary, as you said. Supposing we create, very much like in the US, federal courts of appeal, for appeals over the high court judgments at the state level, and then have the Supreme Court only as the constitutional court, as is basically envisaged, then the problem would be substantially addressed. Right. So there are very simple answers. In fact, K.K. Venugopal, a very distinguished advocate and jurist, has very strongly argued for this recently in a brilliant two-piece article in the Hindu. And I complimented N. Ram, the editor of the Hindu, for actually raising the debate. And I believe we have to look at these issues. Look at politics. There are 2 fundamental schisms. One is the role of the state. We haven't yet really addressed it. As a society, whether distributing television sets is the function of a government, or is it really to ensure that there is rule of law and there is education and health care of reasonable quality? What is the function of a government? We haven't yet come down to it. If it's more like a Maharaja, a king, a monarch, doing pretty much what she or he wanted. The second is, within the governmental structure again, the role of a particular tier of government, an organ of state, is very unclear in the minds of politicians and the public themselves. So the notion, what does the federal government do, what does the state do, what does the local government do, what does judiciary do, what does the police do, what does bureaucracy do, what does the legislature do, what does the executive do? They're simply blurred lines. Therefore, most people expect a legislator to behave like an executive to be utterly impotent and wasteful. A judiciary actually wants to be all the time to be in the executive, sometimes even the lawmaker. All kinds of things are happening. Distortions are there. And when it comes to the people, at the end of the day, in a system where the vote has no meaningful consequence in their lives, and this is a central fact, and in a system where a few votes more or less is going to determine the political outcomes, in an abjectly poor country, what happened is a very natural thing. What's happening in India in terms of money politics is a rational response to an irrational situation. It's a perfectly rational response. I mean, if I were a citizen, if I know that nothing probably of any consequence will happen in terms of the outcome in the election, then I would try to maximize my short-term gain. Right. And if 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees is offered per vote, and this is not an absurd figure, it's a very real figure in India, in several states, particularly Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc. In an abjectly poor country, that's big money. And therefore, I try to maximize my short-term gain. Or else the freebies after the election, the free power and free color TV. Or emotional purchase, because in a primordial society where caste and other loyalties are important, and we haven't really enabled people to discover that there's something more important than your caste, there's something personal for your family, better education for your child maybe, good health care for your family maybe, that's more important than your caste and religion. Unless we establish that link, always these primordial loyalties become all important, and therefore emotional purchase. And politicians have perfected the art of using these 3 purchases: directly buying the vote, offering freebies for the vote, or giving emotional purchase in the form of caste, region, religion, language. And that's why we have to address in all these three ways: local governments, citizen-centric governance, electoral system, a fight against corruption. It can't be a one sector, one bit of it. There's no single silver bullet. I would say these are the 5 bullets together.
Right.
And unless we all understand adequately, I know all of us are deeply concerned, but unless that concern is informed by deep awareness of what's the way forward, it will be merely concern. We have to actually go forward, and that's my argument. Thank you. I'll try and be brief, I know.
Yeah.
Please.
So most of the problems that you mentioned revolved around 2 causes. Basically, there isn't probably a right legalization or probably a right procedure for it. Like you mentioned the Supreme Court thing, right? Like we don't have a separate appeals code, right? And the second one you mentioned was there is no right implementation in spite of the right legalization existing. But the people we expect them to correct are the same people who are getting the purchase out of it by exploiting it. So it's like a loop, it seems to me. Like, how do you resolve that situation?
It's a terrific question. It's a terrific question. You know, politics is about solving the dilemmas of a society. If you have a constitution whose intent is sound, politics is the structure, the bridge between the constitutional values and a society's current culture. Now, if politics that ought to be a solution has become part of the problem, then we have entered into a vicious cycle, the dangerous loop you talked about. But let's go a little backwards. Why did this happen in the first place? When India became free, we had arguably the greatest galaxy of leaders ever assembled on the face of the earth. The only comparison would be to the American freedom fighters and the constitution makers, the founding fathers of the United States. There is no other episode in history when such a galaxy of liberal-minded, well-educated, deeply committed, great leaders came together with a common purpose to build a nation. Post-independence, for some time again, that class played a role. But subsequently, the best and the brightest in society, they have given up on politics. They have thought that they would pursue their own personal goals, which is, after all, their right. That's what life is about, but at the cost of public domain. A vacuum is left, and the scum of humanity increasingly filled that. Or bad practices simply took over. In politics too, like in economics, a Gresham's law operates. Bad politics always drives away good politics. So the answer really lies, in order to break this deadlock, this logjam, in the middle classes, the educated people, the young people who are forward-looking, recognizing the centrality of politics even to economic future of the country, and playing a role. Everybody doesn't have to simply give up everything and then go and become a martyr or a reformer. Everybody can't go and become a contestant. But we all have to play creative political roles as citizens, from registration for voting to voting sensibly and definitely, to mobilizing other people to think rationally, to pursuing rational policies, to enhancing the quality of public discourse, to everything that is required to really make a democracy healthy. Look at the United States, the way for 1 year there was a massive debate in this country on the healthcare policies. And even today, perhaps the last word is not said. And there's going to be an election in the next few months, and maybe people will have a chance to speak up. And I'm sure there'll be a sequel to that. That is the stuff of politics. In India, I don't recall, I'm sure none of you can recall, a single instance when a prime minister ever addressed the country on a single issue of, say, how to educate our people, how to improve the quality of health care, or anything else for that matter. So we have to redefine politics, and unless the middle classes are deeply engaged, and unless they learn the art of pursuit of personal goals along with pursuit of public good simultaneously, we have a problem. Because somewhere we have to break this logjam. Politicians, there's no point blaming them. We all love to hate politicians. Everybody, even in the United States, everybody loves to hate a congressman or a politician. It's a normal democratic skepticism. It's a good, healthy thing. But that doesn't solve the problem. You can improve politics only by better politics and more politics, not by revulsion of politics.
Thank you.
Dr. JP, thank you for coming here. You said politics are intertwined with money, but not only that, in India, they're also intertwined with violence. So where there should have been a competition of ideas, it's being replaced, or it's already is replaced by competition of rhetoric. So what I wanted to ask you is about a specific instance. How do you think the Telangana issue should be handled, and what is your party's stance on that?
Okay, I knew this question would come up in some form or the other. And I'm sure another question will come about reservations. I'll be surprised if it doesn't come up. You know, we love polarities in India. We love a yes or no kind of an approach. But we have to be a little more sensible and practical about dealing with these matters. As I said before, our federalism has matured remarkably. One of the great success stories of India is our federalism. In the past 25 years, there's been a sea change in federalism. We can be very justly proud of that. It's the only great example of a truly diverse society that manages federalism after the United States. In some ways, much more miraculous than the United States because we have such a vast linguistic gulf, apart from poverty, etc. Nevertheless, in a complex federal polity, we are going to have these issues coming up. But we must not do the short of that. And this whole notion that creation of a Telangana is a disaster or it is a solution, it is a cure, both are very dangerous. It's neither a cure nor a catastrophe. We must take it in our stride. It's a practical political arrangement some people are seeking. Now, how practical is it? Is it the best way forward? Is something that the nation must slowly debate and come to terms with it, because the implications are not going to be merely regional or limited to one state. They're going to apply to the whole country. If language is not a marker in a country where every non-Hindi state has one state, one language principle, what will be the new marker so that in Tamil Nadu or in the northern part of the country or eastern or western part of the country tomorrow demands now crop up, how we deal with that will depend on what kind of markers we decide. There's nothing wrong in having markers. Like in the United States in some parts, you can simply say, I will take this parallel and I'll take this vertical, and that's it. I don't care how the state is created, but this is my state. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what India wants. But we must have some uniform principle. The second is the first part of India where a region which is host to the capital city, unlike in the United States, the capitals in India are not only politically centralized, but also economically centralized, demographically centralized, the hubs of economic growth. That region is now seeking to have a separate statehood. Until now, it's the far-flung regions away from big cities that wanted a separate statehood. Now, when economy is increasingly concentrated around big cities, what is the way we address that? Because what happens here could happen tomorrow in Western Maharashtra with Mumbai, Northern Tamil Nadu with Chennai, Southern Karnataka with Bangalore, or some other state with some other capital city or big city. We have to realize, we have to recognize that there is an issue here and find a way of resolving that issue. Once we do those two things, it doesn't matter what we do. We can, because it makes no difference. The real answer lies in local governments, not in one state more or one state less. Neither integration nor separation of a state is going to change anything monumentally. It's just going to create one more chief minister and a cabinet. Nothing more. Yeah.
Since I am the last question, I'll actually ask two questions.
Okay.
My first question is about the distinction that you drew about the Chinese ground level democracy versus our normative democracy in India. I read a book by Fareed Zakaria where he kind of drew a distinction between democracy and rule of law. And he said that rule of law is equally or more important than actually elections and other external characteristics of a democracy. But I don't think that rule of law actually exists at ground level in China either. They don't have even the property rights. Even though they are not strong in India, they are probably stronger in India than in China. So I would like to have your thoughts about why does this work in China. That's question number one. Question number two is about the Maoists insurgency in India. Even people like Arundhati Roy are coming out saying that because of this abject failure of governance in the areas in which Maoists are out there, violence might be the only answer that the people there might have against the Indian
Good questions,
state.
both.
So I don't agree with it. I don't agree with Arundhati Roy's point of view, but I would like your thoughts.
First about Fareed Zakaria and China's rule of law and absence of it. Now, when I made a comparison between India and China, it is just to caution the Indian scholars and others who consistently argue that we are so democratic and wonderful that we have nothing to change. It is not to argue that China is better than India in that respect. That would be a foolish argument. All I'm arguing is that there are facets in Chinese governance which are perhaps more democratic than in a liberal, free Indian society. Over-centralization has been our bane. Decentralization has been their strength. Decentralization, by definition, is a democratization, a tool of democratization. In India, we have not yet done it. Obviously, rule of law is far more deficient in China than in India. In India, the instruments of rule of law are really very strong. They're there. The delivery is weak for a variety of reasons. We have to now set that right. But otherwise, the acceptance of rule of law as a notion, as a norm, or the instruments of rule of law, the constitutional and legal instruments of rule of law, we are ages ahead of China. There's no question. But still, we have to set some things right. Obviously, what we have to demonstrate to the world is that freedom and economic growth are compatible. Democracy is not inimical to growth, because some people are now coming to the dangerous conclusion that growth in an emerging economy means autocracy. So why I'm arguing that China in some ways is democratic is it's the democratic impulses of China that actually led to growth, not the autocratic impulses. You must see both of them together. Otherwise, I agree. But I'm not very great fan of the notion of Fareed Zakaria that you must increasingly give power to the unelected. I recognize the importance of the unelected institutions like the Supreme Court, like the Election Commission, etc. But to think that you can somehow solve the problems of politics by non-political institutions is a typical bureaucratic or middle-class approach. There is no substitute to politics. Clean, decent politics, mobilizing public opinion, more and more and better people playing a creative role, being deeply engaged as citizens and as people who would influence the outcomes at the local level and the state and national level. There's no substitute to that. And the danger is in somehow believing that because we have a Supreme Court, we have an election commission, we have some other strong body, everything will be all right. My friend Seshan, a very good personal friend even today, and Seshan has very few friends remaining actually. He's a good man, but no, very strong and sometimes a acerbic man. He was a great election commissioner. What did he prove? He proved that the constitutional organs in India could be autonomous if they really sought to be so, if they chose to be so. He proved that they could be utterly independent. But could he change the nature of elections in India? Far from it. Seshan himself knows that. It's not his failure. After all, the constitutional organ itself is a creature of the constitution and the law of the land. The parliament gives the mandate for the election commission to function. It can only function within that. It has no mandate to go beyond that. Therefore, to think that somehow by investing so much of authority and prestige and hope in them, we can solve the problems of India, we'd be committing a great mistake. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient. Ultimately, politics will be set right by politics. About Maoists, I'm glad you asked this question. Undoubtedly, the failure of governance in India, our incapacity to fulfill the aspirations of the bulk of the people, and the fact that the accident of birth is determining the future of the bulk of the children, these are the fuels, these are the fodder for generating any number of violent movements. Some of them tend to be Maoist. That's not the only one. We have to recognize that. But having recognized that, if we do not also recognize that in a democratic society where the constitutional liberties are available and vote is available, the only forum of dissent and form of dissent is within the bounds of the Constitution. Namely, you holler, you shout, you protest, you demonstrate without obstructing others, without disrupting other people's freedoms. In front of the White House, when I went the other day, I found two groups of people with banners about all kinds of things. That is a legitimate democratic protest. A space is provided, and they continue to try and attract public attention. And eventually, as and when politicians recognize that they cannot ignore that issue, they will address that. That is democracy. Or else, if you're sufficiently mad about it, like some of the nice Hollywood films, somebody gets into Congress and moves to Congress and the nation and does something about it. That's what politics is about. But if I say that because I'm not happy with the way things are, I will take to the gun, I will extinguish the liberties available under the Constitution, I will take law into my hands, and I will in fact repeal this Constitution itself, abolish the Constitution itself, that's not acceptable. Therefore, the state and the people have every right and duty to do everything within the bounds of Constitution to control it. Let there be no mistake whatsoever. Abraham Lincoln had this question repeatedly posed to him during the Civil War. He said time and again, if the first article of the American Constitution collapses, all else fails. Therefore, in order to preserve the first article, namely there shall be a union of states, I will do whatever it takes. Just like there's a hierarchy of principles or hierarchy of needs, there's also a hierarchy of principles. The ultimate principle for the state is to preserve the constitutional order. Everything else has to become subordinate to that. Having said that, merely by doing whatever it takes to control them, is it enough? No. We also have to create a just order, give confidence to the bulk of the people that, look, we understand your agony, we hear your voice, we created a framework which is more just and more humane. It's not going to be perfect, it's always work in progress, but everybody has a chance. But I don't agree with Arundhati Roy at all in this respect. I know, you don't either. It's very dangerous not to use arguments without understanding the context. She is able to speak out because she has the liberty. What happened in Cambodia, please remember. When Pol Pot was in power, 1/3 of all Cambodian people were decimated. The youngest child was first killed, so that the rest of the family understood the pain. The fellow with glasses, somebody like you or me, just because you wore glasses, the fact that you wore glasses means that you are not a hardworking man. You are not a laborer. Therefore, you are dangerous to society. They killed them. The people with soft hands, they were killed. One after another, the whole family was killed. 1/3 of the whole country was butchered by its own government. It never happened in history. Not even Hitler did that. If that is our notion of a future, I don't think any Indian wants it. Because of temporary anger about the injustices, on occasion we may say, oh, Naxalites are better. But no, it's a dangerous argument. As long as freedom is there, as long as vote is there, there's only one route. There's only one route. That may or may not be recorded, but if you have some questions, I'll be happy to take. So it's up to you. Okay. Okay, I'll just take the question.
You recently become the MLA in Hyderabad for some reason. So I'd like to know some of the positive experiences you had. I mean, like typically in Indian movies and Indian literature, the recent one, they depict Indian politics as something really nasty, something really dirty. I'm sure you met some people or some, at least civilians who were nice to you or who actually abided by the law and gave you a kind of positive spirit, like, yes, there are people who want a change. I'd like to know more about that.
Okay. First of all, we must have a broader argument. Are politicians necessarily scoundrels? Does it mean that the scum of humanity enters politics and all the nice people and wise people are outside politics? Are there two groups of society? Or are politicians doing, in a set of circumstances, whatever they think they should do in order to thrive? We must have some clarity. I would plead with you to recognize that politicians are just another set of human beings. They are not a very specialized set of corrupt, rotten, criminal human beings. They are human beings, period. If you create an institutional framework where by doing what is right, you can also politically prosper, they would happily do that. The prime ministers, the chief ministers, the MPs and MLAs of India, they have not taken a vow to destroy India. They have taken a vow to do whatever it takes to get into power and to do whatever it takes to stay in power. It's for us to create a system where you can do something honorable and decent and public-spirited and yet be politically relevant. If you consistently prove that by doing the nice thing and the right thing, you're politically irrelevant, we're actually driving them to doing something wrong. My experience proved this to be absolutely true. Most of the fellow legislators of mine in my provincial assembly, 80% of them at least, almost everybody, with the exception of myself, they have paid money to get the vote. It's universally known. But despite that, they recognize that they have become victims of a vicious cycle. Given a choice, given a chance, they would like to do something nice and decent. They despair all the time, but they feel that they are in that vicious cycle, they can't get out of the trap easily. So they're not villains, and my faith is indicated. But do they always behave in a manner that really upholds their views? No, because they're creatures of their own party. They're slaves of their party, and they're slaves of the power game. and they simply feel that they have no escape from that. So unless there is external pressure and pull, and unless we mobilize the society and prove that clean politics and honesty are compatible with survival in public office, I don't think we can change that. I'll conclude, Vikram, with just one last word. We have in India today a phenomenal opportunity. We have the technology, thanks to all of you. The world is today truly flat, and we can access almost everything that's happening anywhere in the world, get knowledge of a kind which was unbelievable earlier. We have the resources. May not be enough to have American standard of living, which probably is crazy anyway. It's too high. It's not possible for the whole globe. But we have enough resources to be able to fulfill all the basic needs of Indian people and to give opportunity for us to fulfill our potential as a country. What we lack are institutions. What we lack is the right kind of politics. And without these institutions, technology can be transplanted easily. Institutions take a lot of nurturing. Institutions take a lot of public pressure. Institutions take the middle classes and the educated people to be engaged deeply on a sustained basis. What I'm arguing is, let us be engaged because it's our future that's on the line. And in a fundamental sense, the mankind's future that's on the line. There's no reason for cynicism and despair at all. On occasion, things appear to be exceedingly difficult. But there are forces of change. The young people are increasingly confident. They believe that they can change the country. They're idealistic, whether they live in India or abroad. The economic growth itself is actually spurring forces of change in the country. It's going to make many people ask uncomfortable questions. And the communications revolution that all of you have heralded is reaching India also, many Indians, including the ordinary poor rickshaw pullers and headload workers. And all these will ultimately bring about a fundamental change. But the question is what direction of change it will take. That depends on what we do now. That's why I gave you the Moscow example. If we do the right thing together today, if we give confidence, then that change will be the right one. Otherwise, change will anyway happen, but not necessarily the right one. I ask of you, in our own enlightened self-interest, in the interest of India, and in a larger sense in the interest of the broader humanity, we owe it to ourselves to make a difference to the way the Indian political trajectory takes shape. Thank you very much.